572. I love to tell the story. Will you stand as we sing together? Welcome those who are listening by Facebook, and we appreciate you tuning in to us. So 572. I love to tell the story. Mark chapter 3 as a springboard to our next disciple, Mark chapter 3, and as we look at verse 13, as we talked last week about, Jesus, his plan was to instill in 12 men the message, and as they were to carry it, throughout the whole world. And we see here, he says, and Jesus going up to a mountain, called to him who he would, that they came to him, he ordained 12, that they should be with him, that he might send them forth to preach, and have power to heal sicknesses, to cast out devils. And Simon he church needs a variety of individuals to fulfill the plan that he has for us. And so, as we've been talking about, last time we talked about John, the beloved disciple, one that Jesus entrusted his mother with, And so, of course, we know he wrote 5 of the books of the New Testament. But as we turn and look at Philip tonight, we want to look at him as a practical disciple. And in the first place, we see his calling. If you look over in John chapter 1, verse 43 and 44, we find that Jesus had called Andrew and Simon Peter. And now in verse 43, it said, the day following, Jesus would go forth into Galilee and find Philip and said unto him, follow me. You see, it's just a simple command. But I always felt like there was something about Jesus. There's something about Jesus. I mean, it was his manner or his word. Some people have that way about them, their voice or something, because I've had people ask me, especially when I was younger, said, what do you do for a living? And I said, well, I'm a pastor. Said, well, I thought you might be a radio announcer. Because, I had that low type of voice. But it's ironic as we see here, as we find after calling Peter and Andrew, he sees Philip and says to him, follow me. And we find that he was from Bethsaida, which you wouldn't think much about it, but as we find Jesus is calling the different disciples, they were from different areas. They weren't all from the same area. We know Jesus Iscariot was from where? Remember when I shared that with you? He was the only one that was from Jerusalem or the southern part of the country. And so, as we see the calling, and it didn't say he hesitated, it just says, when he said follow him, he left and followed him. And then we see, as we think about his character, we find that in one of the first places right under his call to follow him, in verse 44, told you it's from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. But then in verse 45, it says that Philip findeth Nathanael. He findeth Nathanael and said to him, we have found him of whom Moses in the law and the prophets did write, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. So you see right off the bat, the next day he went and found Nathanael. He may have been a friend or someone that he knew, and he wanted to tell him about Jesus. Now, who else we know as we looked at the ones ready was one who brought Andrew. Yeah, he brought others to Jesus. And so we see him sharing this with Nathanael. And when he found him, he told him about Jesus. And you see what Nathanael answered in verse 46. And Nathanael said to him, can any good thing come out of Nazareth? You see, Nazareth was just a little town, small town. And you wouldn't think, as they were looking for the Messiah, that the Messiah would come out of that little village or place. But I've come to understand in my life that God does things unbeknown to us. Things that we might think is small or insignificant, but you should never overlook that, because God speaks volumes in that. So Nathanael, like as I said, he was just asking Philip, he said, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Just like somebody might say, can any good thing come out of Granite Falls or Kannapolis or, any town where you might want to mention it? But he said to him, and I like what Philip's answer was, come and see. Isn't that what we ought to do with folks? When we run into people or even family, invite them to church, invite them to events, invite them to things.
so that they can come and see. I mean, he could have told him right off the bat, what he understood and all, but it's important for you to experience it firsthand. There's no such thing as secondhand religion. You got to experience Jesus for yourself. You can't save anybody. I know there's one group that say they can, but I said you're dead wrong, because you have to experience Jesus firsthand. Nobody can do it for you. I wish I could save people for them, but he said that I'm the way, the truth, and life. No man come far but by me. And so we need to be like Philip. Whenever we engage people and we talk to them about Jesus, I said, just come and see. Come and see. And let them hear, for themselves. Because it's important that we do that for individuals. And then the second piece in John where we find Philip mentioned is in John chapter 6. You read over there with me. This is where the crowds had gathered, and it was time of the Passover and the feast. And in verse 5 of chapter 6, it says, when Jesus lifted up his eyes and saw a great company come to him, he said to Philip, whence shall we buy bread that they may eat? I mean, we know, as we was reading other parts, that there were like 5,000 men, and that was just men. That wasn't counting women and children and stuff. And you wonder, why did he ask Philip? Well, it's where he was from. Who would know better than someone who was from the area? Isn't it good for us if we're looking or seeking to ask somebody from an area? I remember when I was doing a focus team leading, youth revival. We went. The church was in Frog Pond, North Carolina. I'd never been to Frog Pond in my life. So we saw a sign that said Oakboro. So I went down there and didn't know the area, so I went to the barber shop. Now, you can learn a lot by going into a barber shop or a beauty shop. Ouch. But anyway, I went in there and I said, we're a team from Gardner Webb. We're supposed to be, preaching revival in church over here, Pleasant Grove, and it's in Frog Pond. And I have no idea where that is. And this one guy, the barber, he looked at me, kind of grinned, and he said, well, let me tell you, you turn around, you go back out at the intersection, when you come in, to Oakboro, it's called Big Lick. Okay, take a right at Big Lick. And you drive to the end of that road, it'll dead end, and that's it's Liberty Hill Road that I was going to be on. Then the other's going to be 2427 Albemarle Road. And you'll come to Frog Pond. And you turn right there and the church will be on the left. And by the time I thought he was pulling my leg. But as I followed his directions, he was right. Isn't it good that when you are somewhere where you don't know, I know you got Jeepus now, but before Jeepus, you oftentimes had to stop and ask people. And so as we find Jesus looking at Philip, he said, where can we buy enough bread, to feed this crowd? And we see Philip's question. And he said, he said to prove him for himself, knew what he was going to do. That was funny. Jesus was really putting him to a test. He said he was a follower of Christ, and he left all to follow him and trusted that Jesus would meet their needs. But here was a situation where he was faced with feeding this multitude of people, and Jesus asked him, where can we buy bread? But little did he know that Jesus knew what he was going to do. See, that's funny. To me, that's funny, because sometimes we think Jesus, he's going to ask us, and Philip was really being practical. Because what he said to him, he said, this much would not buy enough to feed 200 pennyworth of bread, not sufficient for them, that every one of them may eat a little bit. So you see, he was practical. See, he allowed practicality to override miraculous. See, he had not learned who Jesus was or is. And we need to learn that Jesus can do more than what we can ever think or imagine in our lives. Yeah. And so we see Philip here. I said, well, I might know where you could find it, but we don't have enough money to really buy it. Well, Jesus didn't ask him that, did he? He just said, where can we get food? Even though he knew where he was going to get it, you know. And so as we look at another incident, look over with me to John chapter 12, verse 20, 22. And we see this in conjunction with Andrew. You remember when we talked about Andrew, whenever people wanted to, come to Jesus or meet Jesus, we see in verse 20 it says, there were certain Greeks among them that came up to worship at the feast, and the same came therefore to Philip. See, since Philip was from Bethsaida, which was close to many of the Greek and Gentiles and others, they may have felt more comfortable, coming to him. And that's true in anything. Some people, if you're from around here, like I say, you're from around here, some people more comfortable than if a stranger, Of course, they can listen to me. They know I'm not from around here. I mean, I live here, but I'm not from here. You know what I'm saying? Of course, most of them think I'm from Georgia, but I don't think so. I've heard Georgia crackers, But anyway, they felt that here was one that they could, inquire of to see if they could see Jesus. And so we find that they said, sir, we would see Jesus. Boy, I love when people ask me that. Does anybody ever ask you that? We would see Jesus. Lord, I get excited when I said, well, let me show you, and all. But we see as Philip, when he was addressed, he come and he told Andrew. You see, that's where that two comes in. As I've told you before, it's better when two come together, when two agree. And I tell deacons, when you visit, you ought to have two. And, in the Old Testament and even in our world today, it's better if you have two witnesses. But I always say, though, it don't need to be your spouse or family. It has to be two different individuals, So in the Old Testament, if you had two, that was truth. When you had two witnesses, that was truth. And the law, they accepted it, as such. And so that's why it was important, as Philip wanted to pull Andrew in, and that's nothing wrong with that. If you, are asked, well, let me go and talk to, just don't wait on the preacher. I had one to tell me one time, let me go get the preacher. I said, you tell that man how to be saved? You don't need the preacher. But, I was glad to go. But you ought to be able to lead a person to Jesus Christ. If you had an experience with Jesus, you ought to know how to bring that, to that. But as we see here, Philip, once again, he could have took him to Jesus himself. But I like the way that he pulled Andrew, in with that. Because like I said, we can do things ourselves, but it's always good to include others, and all in the process. That's why, it took me a long time to understand delegation. I could do things, but isn't it better to help someone else, to bring them in, to mentor or to train them, to show them? Because look, you might be robbing that person of a blessing. I don't want to rob a person of a blessing, you know, because there's a joy when you serving the Lord. Or serving. There's joy, you know, he uses. And so as we see Philip, as he approached this from that vantage point, you know, and really, you know, it would maybe carry a little bit more weight, but we don't know. But he said to him he wanted Andrew to come to tell Jesus. And then the fourth thing, the last time is that Philip is mentioned here, is John 14. As we see in John 14, 8 through 10, Jesus, you know, had talked about not let your heart be troubled, and he was saying to him, you know, who he was, the true way, the truth, and the life. And then he goes on in verse 7 and says, if you had known me, you should know my Father also. From henceforth you know him, have seen him. You see, what was so hard for the Jewish people and even for Jesus' disciples to understand that he and the Father were one. See, he wasn't only the Son of Man, he was the Son of God. And he and God were one, you know, along with the Holy Spirit. And so when he began to say this, look at verse 8. Philip said to him, Lord, show us the Father, and it'll suffice us. See, he'd been with Jesus a while, but he still didn't understand. And it's the same with you and I. We can talk, we can witness, we can share, but sometimes people still don't get it. I bet teachers many times, they scratch their head when they teaching their students, you know, and they do it as simplistic as they can, but sometimes, you know, they just don't get it. Preachers the same way. You know, I don't know what it would take unless they're just not tuning in, you know, and focusing or what I call listening, you know, to what is being said. Because Jesus not only told them that he and the Father are one, he showed it many, many times, you know. And he said, Jesus said in verse 9, have I been so long time with you, and you do not know me, Philip? I mean, that would be really heartbreaking. Those that he had called, those he were mentoring and entrusting and teaching and using all kind of ways to show them, you know, about God and about what he is going to be doing. Because he goes on and says, he that has seen me has seen the Father. You know, it kind of it's funny in a way because some children favored their dad, and you can tell whose father they are, you know, who's their dad, you know, because they look like them, and they may even act like them, you know what I'm saying, and all. And see, the thing about Jesus was, you know, he did, and he spoke and all, so he would reflect, you know, the Father, you know, to his disciples and to those who followed him. And so he was saying, how sayest thou then, show us the Father? You know, I know Jesus is getting ready to go to the cross and everything. He thought he had, you know, done well by instructing and by, you know, showing them. But even at best, you know, people will still miss it. I think a lot of people miss it a lot of times. And so I'm sure he's kind of disappointed, you know, in Philip because, you know, here he was going back to the Father and he's been trying to let them in on him because, see, that was the thing about it. The God of the Old Testament, to many, was a vengeful, wrathful, you know, God. But really, if you look at it, he was a God of love and a God of care, and that's what Jesus was trying to pull together for them. It's like little girl said one time, I don't like the God of the Old Testament, but I do like Jesus. But they don't realize it's one and the same. They're one and the same. And so it's important as we see, and we need to understand our own selves. And sometimes wonder what would it take for people to get this? To get this. And then he goes on and says in verse 10, believest thou not that I am in the Father, and the Father in me? And the words that I speak unto you, I speak not of myself, but the Father that dwells in me, he's doing the works. So you see, the thing about Jesus was, his whole ministry and mission was to point people to God. His whole life, it was to show people God. And then he goes on and says, believe that I am in the Father, and the Father in me, or else believe me for the very work's sake. So you see, you just need to accept it, by faith, And even though you may not understand it fully, and I know there's a lot of things that we don't understand fully, but that don't mean it's not true and it's not real, Because I felt like by studying Jesus and watching him and his life, it helped me to understand God. It helped me to understand God more, And that way we can share with people whenever they kind of confused, because it is hard to explain to someone. You think about God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. I mean, our God is a great God. He's a great God. And he expresses himself in these ways. As we know, God is creator, sustainer. Jesus pointed us to God, and the Holy Spirit points us to Jesus. You see? So you see how they interconnect or intertwine. The three in one. And so as he was trying to help Philip and his disciples to understand, verily, verily, I say to you, he that believes on me, the works that I do, he shall do also in greater works. Isn't that great to know tonight? That we are able to do, but not only do works, but we'll do greater works. Greater works. Than we can even imagine. It's because I go to the Father. He goes. He's there with him. And so as we see Philip, as he was trying to reason this out, his practical mind, as I said, that's why I call him the practical disciple, because he was trying to make sense of it, in his own mind, rather than seeing it through the eyes of Christ. That's what we got to do. And through his word, this is one thing that we had that disciple didn't have. We got the gospel. We got his word, that we can learn and we can know without a shadow of doubt that Jesus is the Son of God. Yeah, he is the Son of God. Probably one of the last places that we find about Philip. And as we conclude, some historians think that Philip went on to Central Asia and preached gospel, and then he died in Hierapolis. But then others say that, you read in Acts, but believe that's a different Philip, because remember that Philip chosen as a deacon, and then he went on to be an evangelist, So we think that was two different, Philips. Than this one. And then some claim that he was crucified, under Emperor Domitian. So there's different historians that say a different thing. But we know when you follow Jesus, it costs. It'll cost you, and it did many of them their very life, but that's part of following Jesus. as he gave his life, we're willing to give ours, as well. Okay, anybody got any questions or comments or anything? Okay, I hope as you look at each of these disciples, you might can identify with them, and all, because they are all different. They're none alike, and all. So I hope as we go through these, and this is the 6th one. I can't believe we've been through half of them already. And then some of the others will not be as well known, and so we'll be looking at, them as well. But it don't matter. They're just as important to Jesus as these first 6 that we talked about. And so don't ever think that you're not important, that God doesn't love you and that God can't use you. He can. And what the joy is, I'm thankful that he calls us and he uses us. And so it's just amazing. It's amazing. How great is our God. Okay. All righty. Let's break up in our prayer cells and then you're free to go. Thank you. Look forward to the Lord's